Let's talk generally about this survey. Why you guys wanted to do this, see what Canadians are thinking about forgiving debt.
Yeah, I think, it is an interesting time. Certainly, COVID has thrown us into a new world, there's no question. But being in the debt industry, one of the things that we have become really aware of is there's a lot of shame and stigma around debt. And so this survey was really to understand, has there been some empathy or compassion change in Canadians around this idea of debt, particularly because we're all collectively experiencing that challenge.
So, talk to me a bit about the findings. Did you find more empathy?
We did. Dare I say, I suppose that's a bit of a good news story of what's come out. We found that Canadians were certainly more empathetic to this idea of debt forgiveness, particularly around three areas. I'm just going to check to make sure I say it right. So spouse or loved one, job loss, and the other thing that really came out was student loans. So we're a lot more forgiving, particularly if people are experiencing those things. And there's been no shortage of job loss this year, of course.
Yeah, I was looking at it, and it's interesting to see so many people thinking about it a lot more. Were there reasonings given in the survey?
There was no reasonings necessarily. We did see that women were slightly more forgiving, empathetic, and compassionate than men. But one thing I can say is the survey highlighted that we're all experiencing a little bit more compassion. I think that is driven in this idea that we are all experiencing it. And if we haven't experienced it personally, we usually have someone we love or care about who has experienced debt. And I think it was a good thing because the worst thing that I think could happen to Canadians right now is to continue to suffer in silence if they are experiencing debt. And so seeing that the community has a little bit more empathy, humanness, compassion around that really allows people who are struggling to not suffer in silence and be able to reach out for help early if they need it. And I think that's really key.
And it's obviously quite topical as we start talking about the people who mistakenly got CERB and are being asked to pay it back. And there's a push to have that debt forgiven. Talk to me a bit about that.
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation, and I might have a little bit of a different take. We actually have seen a lot of calls of people who applied for CERB under distress. Of course, they've lost their job, to be granted the monies from the federal government, and then only later to be found out that, oh, actually you didn't qualify and now you have a $26,000 bill to pay back that monies. And it's quite devastating for people. And so when we look at debt forgiveness, I think something I'd like to remind everyone is we actually do have insolvency legislation which governs this. And within insolvency legislation, all debts are forgivable and dischargeable with the exception of three things that we've all agreed are not. And those three things are child support and spousal support. So that's not something that ever can be restructured or forgiven for, of course, right reasons to support our children. Second thing is fraud or misrepresentation. And then the third thing is student loans if they've been within 7 years. And so when we talk about CERB payments, really it comes down to, was there fraud or misrepresentation? Which can only be determined in an appropriate court of law, of course. And if the answer is no, there's been no misrepresentation or fraud in the application of CERB, then those repayments absolutely would fall into appropriate, forgivable, and dischargeable debts. So,
yeah, let's talk a bit about advice. If someone is drowning in debt, what are their steps? Insolvency might not be the first step, but what steps should they be looking at if they have a lot of debt right now?
Absolutely. And you're right. Insolvency is definitely not the first thing to look at, but I do encourage everyone to give a call to experts. So, maybe that's calling your bank, depending on the situation you're in. Maybe that's speaking to your creditors early if you think you can't make your payments. But I always encourage people, if you're really feeling like you can't pay your debts as they become due and they're starting to affect your mental well-being, give Bromwich+Smith a call. We do free consultations. And so insolvency might not be the route that you're going down, but you'll get some great advice that you can then be empowered to use so you can make the right determination for your family.
Now, if someone does meet the criteria for insolvency in their life, what would that process look like? Because lots of people, it's a big unknown. What is it? What's happened? So
that's a great question. Thanks for asking it. There's two definitions of insolvency. So one is your liabilities exceed your assets. And then second is just simply that you're unable to pay your debts as they become due. So if you're falling into either of those two categories, something to definitely pick up the phone. And I think it feels like a really scary process. And I think that's because, debt forgiveness actually starts with self-forgiveness. I've yet to meet someone who purposely goes out and not pays their bills. Like, more often than not, there's an external trigger. And so it's really important just to reach out for help. That first phone call is actually just over the phone, talking to our debt relief specialist. And they're really experts in being able to understand what's happening with your financial situation. What does your income look like? What does your assets look like? What do your debts look like? So we can figure out whether or not your creditors actually would be in a position to be able to help you restructure your debts and come up with a new plan to repay them.
Mm-hmm. Now, when talking about stigma, is insolvency the same as bankruptcy? Is that the same or is that different?
Yeah, that's a great question. So insolvency, there's the insolvency legislation in Canada, and there's two programs that fall under that. The first one is consumer proposals. A lot of people don't know about this one, but the thing that most like about it is you don't have to give up your assets. You don't have to give up your house. I think we have this vision of losing everything, if you will, and that's not the case in that scenario. And the second one is bankruptcy. So we're talking about one of those two solutions in the Insolvency Act.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's still pretty early, but have you heard of anyone with the CERB repayments who's gone the insolvency route yet, or are they kind of waiting to see what happens?
No, absolutely. I think we saw at the beginning of this year, last month, we saw an influx of phone calls into the line. I think everybody was sort of crossing their fingers and hoping there might be some more relief programs that were announced on a personal level, but there wasn't. And so, there was quite a few Canadians who were given CERB repayment notices. And so absolutely, we have helped a number of those clients who just haven't been able to pay it back. They applied for those monies under distress to get through a difficult time. And, there's no more money now than there was then. And so they are in a position where they unfortunately can't pay them back. So we have helped a number of those clients already.
Mm-hmm. A bit of a big question, but when we talk about insolvency and legislation, how much of a cost will it have on society to forgive some of these debts?
Oh, that's a great question. And I think it might be a little bit fully loaded. So, when we talk about insolvency, the first indication is, well, of course you have to pay your debts, right? You've promised you're going to pay them and you have to pay them. But as a society, we have decided that people deserve second chances. Canadians are filled with hope and sort of this idea of jubilee. And so that's why the Act exists. And I think in order for society to thrive, we have to have the opportunity to redeem ourselves. And that's what this legislation is about. The alternative to not having a legislation is to leave a large portion of our society, particularly right now. We've talked about the K-shaped recovery, where we know there's certain individuals who have been more impacted than others, literally leaving them without a path forward. And I think that's actually a worse solution than, not paying back our creditors. Again, nobody intentionally does that, I don't believe, particularly right now with everything that's happening. So I do think it's important that we have this protection for our people who are feeling exceptionally vulnerable right now in Canada.
Mm-hmm. And your survey shows more people might be willing as a society to be more forgiving when it comes to debt.
Yes, and I think that's a great news. I always laugh and use this example. I call my girlfriend and I say, oh, I'm having a fight with my husband. And she'll say, come on over, have a glass of wine. But, today I can't call her and tell her I'm having trouble paying my mortgage, right? There's still that stigma around it. So, being in a place where, if our friends, if our family are struggling with debt and they feel comfortable that they can speak about it, they feel comfortable to reach out for help about it, that puts us as a society in a much better space than suffering in silence.
Mm-hmm. So again, anyone who's suffering, first step is just to talk with someone?
Absolutely. I would suggest reaching out to a professional, just like Bromwich+Smith. Get that free consultation. You don't have to move forward, but more information is going to arm you so that you're able to make the best decision for your family. You're going to learn about some things perhaps that you didn't know, that your retirement savings are protected, that there's some exemptions in your home and your vehicle. So if you are looking at the worst case scenario, don't go ahead and liquidate all your assets. Make a phone call and find out the information first, and then you can make the appropriate decision for what's right for you.